Okay, so this is part two. I just actually stopped the recording and I'm just picking up where I left off, literally where I left off in the first part of the video. So when I stopped, we had just implemented, uh, basically the ability to run some SQL against our application or against our database that we've built in. And one of the things I started pointing out was how this data grid view, there weren't very tight controls on it. We could do all kinds of sort of things that we don't really want to do. The point of this query or this application is really just to show the result set. We're not trying to allow the user to edit any of this. Um, and frankly, there are a lot of properties that go along with a data grid view. So let's start looking at those a little bit and kind of tighten the screws on this just a hair, so we can make sure that there's no confusion about what the application should do and what the user should be able to do. So the first thing I'm gonna come in is I'm gonna select my data grid view. And then if we start looking at the properties that are available to us, do we want to let users add rows? We don't. Do we want to let users delete rows? We do not. Can they resize the columns and order the columns? I guess we don't really care. Maybe we just leave those as default. Do we want them to resize the rows? I'd say probably not, because we've already set the columns to fit the size of whatever they're there or whatever's there. Do we want to show a row header? Now, a row header, if I run this one more time for you, this is a row header right here. Do we want to show a row header? Probably not. So let's go find the row header setting, which is probably down here. Row header visible, we'll say false. And so now what you'll see, and I'm going to make this guy a little bit bigger just so um, we can see it. All right. So we set the row header to false. So now when we run this, if I press F5, you'll notice the row header is gone. So we can resize columns if we want to. Um, you can still edit, right? So do we really want that to be able to, the user to be able to do that? Probably not. So if we come down here and say, it's been a while. What's the selection mode? What am I looking for? I think there is a edit mode. What is that? No, that's not what I'm looking for. Let's see. You would think it would be called edit mode or cell edit or read only. Read only. Haha, there we go. So let's set read only to true. So now let's see if we get the ability to. Right now I'm trying to type into stuff and I can't select. I can still select columns or rows or whatever, but I can't type anything. So again, you can mess with this. You'll notice that if you click on the column headers, it automatically sorts for you, that sort of thing. But just tighten the screws a little bit. You can kind of take this any direction you want to go with it. The nice thing about the data grid view is it really is very powerful and it gives you a lot of options and you can do a lot of really cool things with it. We just don't need that level of awesomeness for this particular example that we're working on now. Okay, so the next thing I want to do is I want to start looking at the history and kind of what we run as we go, right? So let's come back into our design view. And if you click on the data grid view, you'll notice there's a little itty bitty arrow up here that pops up. I'm going to click on that and then click on the edit columns button. Okay, so in one instance here, we're not doing any kind of column creation stuff because this is all going to be driven by what our query is, right? So whatever we select is going to represent whatever columns we get here because it's going to be tied directly to our result set. Conversely here, this isn't going to be dynamic, right? This is going to be a static set of columns that we know we want to capture data for every time. We're not binding this to any sort of data source. All we're going to do is every time we run a query, we're going to update this particular table by adding a row that has some information in it that's relevant to what we just did. So again, click on the little arrow, go to edit columns, and then you can click on the add button. Okay. And what the column name is the instance name. The header text is what's actually going to show up in the header. So if we were really being diligent, we would rename these so they all make sense, probably. But I'm going to leave them column 1, column 2, column 3 for what we're doing here is fine. But we do need to obviously edit the header text, right? So I'm going to call the first column date time. Now, you can have different kinds of columns in your data grid view. You can have text columns, you can have image columns, you can have checkboxes. For what we're doing here, all we need is text, and they're all going to be read-only, okay? So I'm going to click Add, and then we'll do the next one, which would be the source. And here I'm kind of envisioning is where we'll put our connection string. Elapsed will be the amount of time it took for our query to run. Let's see, rows is going to be the number of rows that return in our result set. Error is going to show any errors if we have any with our SQL. Because you don't always get the SQL right the first time. And then the SQL statement, oops, it was going to be our last column, okay? So we'll close him. So you'll notice now we have date, time, source, elapsed, row, error, SQL statement. Now you can come in here and for each individual column in your table, you can set certain properties. So what I'm going to do is, if you'll notice if we do this right here, we end up with some blank space. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back into my edit columns and I'm going to set the SQL statement to carry the most weight so that it will always fill out. So if I select the SQL statement and I set auto size mode to fill, basically it will always make sure that our grid goes all the way across, even when we maximize it. So if I run this, if I maximize this, make it bigger, you'll notice that the SQL statement carries all the weight. Now you can set different percentages, you can set static values, etc. But you know, in this particular case, we're going to set it to auto resize the columns anyways. But just for the sake of you know, making it look aesthetically pleasing from the beginning, we'll just set that to fill. Okay. Now what I want to have happen though is anytime I run a query, I want to capture the time that we just ran that. So basically the time that I just pressed F5. The source is going to show our connection string. What database are we talking to? Elapsed is going to show basically how long it took for this query to run and return the result set. The rows are going to show the number of rows that were returned in the result set. So in this case, 5, right? An error is if we run into an error, like if I do classes doesn't exist, right? So this is trying to select something from a table that doesn't actually exist. So if I hit F5, what's going to happen is I'm going to get some error message, right? And so instead of showing an error box or a message box, I'm going to put that error message right here, okay? And then each time we run the query, we're going to put the query right here in this text box or in this column, okay? Um, so let's start trying to tackle that, right? We have basically everything laid out that we need. And if we start to think about where this needs to go, so we're basically going to run the query. When the query comes back successfully, we need to be able to put the basically insert our row, right? So what I'm going to do first thing is I'm going to create a date time object called dt1, and there's C# gives you this really nice date time dot now, so we can get we can get the time. Um, And then on the other side of this, I'm going to create a datetime query, call it dt2 equals, and I'm going to get datetime.now, right? You can see what's going on here, right? I'm going to use these two values to figure out how long it took for this query to run. That's kind of my goal here. Okay, so now let's look at what we need to do to add a row to this. And there's one thing I already don't like, right? So just like we did with the last table, this is all editable. This is a new row. We can add new rows, that sort of thing. We don't want this. So I'm going to go in and basically get rid of this guy. So if I select him, I don't want to see a row header. So we can turn off row headers. Visible equals false. Um, we want to make it read only, which is true. And we want to allow users to add rows as false, allow users to delete rows is false. We can leave the rest kind of the same, right? All right, so now when we run it, we don't get the empty record there, right? The only thing that's going to populate or modify this particular grid view is our code that basically runs when we execute a query, okay? Okay, so let's start looking at how to add a row. So we named our data grid view here history. So I'm going to say history. You can get the rows, which is a collection of objects associated with that particular data grid view. and then we're going to add a row, right? Now, if you look at this add function is very overloaded, but what we want to do, you can pass it a row, you can pass it an integer, or you can pass it a string array or an array of objects. We're going to go with this one, right? So I'm going to say new string array, and basically I'm just going to create like a static um, array, right, where we're going to put our objects in there. So we said and again, the array, so the first index of the array is going to align with the first column of the table. The second index of the array is going to be the second column, and so forth. So date time that we ran the query, well, we know that that is already here, right? So dt1. So what I'm going to say is dt1, and you can get these, they have these nice two short short date string. And then I'm going to concatenate that with dt1 dot short, oops, too short time string. Okay. Oh, oops. Might help if I put the parens on there. Let me unpin this guy. All right. And then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to put a comma, right? So the next thing we want to add, what comes after that, is our source. We know that our source is however we have our connection string, right? So, oops. So I'm going to go back down to the bottom here. The second thing we're going to add is our connection string, right? And then the third thing we have is the time elapsed, right? So very simply, we can say dt, oops, numlock on. Let's put it in parentheses because we're doing a little bit of math here. dt1 dot, or dt1 minus dt, I can do it backwards, dt2 minus dt1, right? And then we're going to say toString because this is a string array, right? After we get the time elapsed, we're going to get rows, the number of rows, right? So really easy to get the number of rows would be to say, tell me how many rows are in this table, right? And we can do that. What do we call that table? Properties. We called it results. That's the name of our data grid view here. So we can results dot rows dot count, right? I guess I need parens there too. No, it is. It's not that. It's I need to make it a string because that's going to give me a number. There we go. Okay, after we get the number of rows, the next thing is any error messages that we get. So we set up something to capture our error message. It's a global variable called error message. So we'll put that there. And then the last thing that we're going to do is we need to put our query, right? And again, we have a global variable called Q. Remember where we did that up here? So we have a global variable called Q. So we'll put Q in here last, right? Cool. So let's what else can we do? Oh, one other thing I want to do is I want to sort my table so that the last query I ran is always at the top, right? So let me just run this and you guys can get an idea of what's going to happen here. So if I do select star from classes, you'll notice that we get our result set, we get the time that we ran it, we get our provider, we get the amount of time it took for the query to run, we get the number of files. This didn't have an error, right? So that's good. And then we get the query that we run. If I make up some other table where I know we're going to get an error and I run it, you'll see that now we see the errors right here, right? The same error that just popped up. But what I want to have happen is I want this particular, this particular query, this particular row to show up on the top. I want to sort descending by time. Now we'll see an issue right here, right? 9:01 a.m. That's going to probably cause an issue, right? How's it going to know how to sort that? So what we may need to do is actually carry it out to milliseconds, right? So let's do that first, and then we'll be able to sort a little more easily. So instead of date time to short time string, there's actually a to long time string, which is going to include those milliseconds, right? So that'll take care of that. And so now when we run this, if I press F5 and then I press F5 again, you'll see now we get, different we're able to sort better, essentially, right? But I want it to look like this. I want the last time we ran it to appear on the top, so the oldest query will be on the bottom. So how would we do that? Um, there is a sort function associated with data grid views. Recall that our data grid view is called history. And there's a function called sort that takes two parameters. The first is the column that we want to sort, and then the second is the list sort direction that we want. So if you remember, we didn't rename this instance. It was called column one, right? So if we look at our columns, our date time, the name of our date time column is column one. So what I'm going to type here is I'm going to pass it column one. And then what I want to say is list sort direction dot descending, right? And that should take care of that for us. And then the one thing we'll do here as well, like we did on the other grid, is we'll auto resize columns. Columns, there we go. So let's run this again. So if I press F5, you'll notice that our columns all fit, which is good. We're getting everything that we want to capture. And again, if I put in something stupid and I press F5, we're going to get this error message box because of what we've done up here. And we're going to get rid of that here in just a second because now we have our error showing right here, right? Error message is right there so we can see what that is. Okay. All right. And you'll also notice that it's descending. The order is descending, right? So everything, all is right in the world essentially. All right. Now what we need to add here, if you can see, this is going a little long, is we can make sure that we always have a, actually it may do it for us. Yeah, we may have to add a scroll panel or scroll bar onto our form here as well, onto that bottom grid view. But essentially what we're getting though is what we're going for, right? We're getting the ability to add a record every time we run a query. Now, what we probably want to have happen is if we get an error here, we probably don't want this to remain, right? We want to reset that grid view because we didn't actually get any data back. That could be confusing. We also want to get rid of the error message box again because we're showing it um, in the table on the bottom anyway, so we don't really need to keep that there, right? So what I'll do here is I'm going to go ahead and basically just remove that piece of code that actually pops up the message box. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a data table that's just empty, right? Oops, parentheses. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this particular data grid view, which again is called results, and I'm going to bind it to that empty data table, right? So now what's going to happen is if we successfully run this the first time, right, we get a result set. But if we don't get a result set, and let me just make this a little bit bigger. If we don't get a result set, I want this to clear out, right? And you'll notice now that clears out and we see that our error message is this and we have it where we want it, right? Okay. What else can we do? I mean, there's a lot of different ways that you could take this. What if it would be useful to have the ability to have multiple queries up here? From, what was the other table called? Students, I think. Students, right? If I press F5, it's not going to like me. It's going to say there's issue, right? So what if it would be a nice feature to be able to basically select the query that I want to run and then only submit that query or select. And if I don't select anything, then I guess we'll have our application assume that we want to run everything that's in our text box up here. So let's make that happen. Let's do this. Let's say we'll leave this the way it is. Q equals querybox.text. But then let's say caps lock off. Let's say if what do we call that? Query text, query box. If query box dot selected text does not equal an empty string, then we want to say q equals query box dot selected text. Right? That'll accomplish it for us, right? So let's run that and see what we get. So I don't have anything selected in my box, right? So I'm gonna hit F5. So it should have selected everything, right? Which it did. Let me make this a little bit bigger. If I add another query, and press F5, we get an error, right? We didn't select anything. We get an error because essentially we have two from statements. We have issues going on here. If we try to look at this as an entire statement, it's poorly formatted, and obviously it's not going to work. But if I come in and I just select just that piece of it and I press F5, you'll notice we don't run into any issues and we get the results that we're looking for.